Good morning. This is Dr. Ken Long from Delro. Morning of March 6, 2012. Pardon my scratchy throat. I want to just conduct a quick argument map of an MMAS thesis on water distribution to show how we analyze the consistency, coherence, and clarity of a master's thesis argument across the 5 chapters. In Chapter 1, which is concerned with an introduction to what are we studying and why is it important, who cares, and why bother, is to establish the significance. The student is looking at water distribution, potable water distribution, is concerned about it because of the effect of budget considerations, the impact on lives that are put at risk in delivering the water, and the risk to mission accomplishment that failure to perform the mission would entail. In Chapter 2, the literature review, he's going to provide context in order to understand, for the general reader, the questions, the environment that the question is being operated in, the issues of concern to stakeholders, any theories or methods that may be applied. Chapter 3, he's going to describe his methodology for conducting his analysis. We'll get to that in a second. In Chapter 4, he's simply going to describe the results of his analysis. He's going to do it. In Chapter 5, he's going to talk about the findings and conclusions, the relevance and the significance of those findings. In other words, what did he find? What does it mean? What are the limits of his insights? How significant are the findings? What are the implications for policymakers? And where are directions for future research indicated? So what we're going to do is we're going to follow his line of reasoning, and we will finish up by coming back to the literature review to make sure that everything that is described in his methods, conduct of analysis, and interpretation has context that is provided inside the literature review. So I'm going to come back to that last to show what's got to be in there and why. So that what we can do in Chapter 2 is tell a clear story with news that we can use. What the student is going to do in this case is use a case study analysis. He's looking at Vietnam, Desert Storm, Desert Shield, and OIF-OEF, and the water distribution issues associated in there. Why? Because there's a lot of good documented evidence in those 3 areas. They represent a range of military options and operations that are directly applicable to the future battlefield, which will be a combination of combined arms maneuver and wide area security, and that can be found inside those 3 case studies. So in this case, we've established the connection between the relevance of the past case studies and the way it can inform the future. When he conducts his analysis of those case studies, he's going to be identifying themes that were important, the issues and the criteria that people involved at the time thought were important, so that we can see, do they still remain important in our current decision makers' mind. He's going to define an evaluation criteria of suitable, feasible, acceptable. So what comes out of the case studies could be some good ideas about what the future for water distribution ought to hold. And it will also provide the meat, the operational definitions of what we mean by suitable, feasible, acceptable when we evaluate his recommendations. Then he's going to generate a number of solutions. I've arrayed this as a solution space in 3 dimensions. It's not the only way it can be done, but it's for illustration purposes. The evaluator or the committee is concerned that the recommendations that he makes cover the battlefield with enough differences in them that we can see some representative good ideas. We don't want him considering solutions from too narrow a space. So we can consider one dimension to be the distance from the source. A strategic distance from the source of the water to the consumer of the water would mean water that's being secured in CONUS and then shipped strategically into a theater of operation. Tactical distance from the source would mean water being generated either through contract or manufacturing inside the divisional area, the tactical unit. Operational would be inside that theater but outside the division area, so perhaps purchased at a port or a major city, and then trucked an operational distance into the division area. The second dimension is military or civilian solution, when it comes to both making and delivering the water. A military solution would have green suiters with Army equipment making the water and then delivering it with Army trucks. A pure civilian solution would have contractors buying water or making water and then delivering it to the division with commercial trucks. So there could be some combinations of mixed military and civilian as well. But that's the military or civilian dimension. And then finally, the unit of issue or the packaging strategy, featuring small bottles, stackable boxes, water buffaloes, 400-gallon, 5K tanker trailers, or bags. So inside those three dimensions, there's at least 60 different combinations of these three-dimensional variables. And what we're looking for is not an exhaustive review of all 60, but a representative sample of the kinds of solutions that are available, so that when he makes his analysis and recommendations, we're sure that he's cast his net wide enough to give an appropriate level of analysis of what's really feasible. So he will review his case studies. He's going to generate some solutions. He's going to evaluate them by suitable, feasible, acceptable, which he's going to define in Chapter 3. And then in Chapter 4, he actually takes those choices, runs them through this evaluation model of suitable, feasible, acceptable, and let's suppose that he comes up with 4 different ideas. Each one of those, one of which is the status quo, by the way. Each one of those potential solutions is evaluated by the criteria of suitable, feasible, acceptable, and the results are recorded for that analysis, and then he conducts a comparison between those to see what he can see, to see is there something that stands out. He will discuss those conclusions and recommendations in Chapter 5, and then if there's something that he deems as significantly better and more robust than the current status quo, he has a recommendation which he will then use a .mil-PF analysis on, doctrine, organization, training, material, leadership, personnel, and facilities, to describe the magnitude of change that adopting his recommendation would really entail. So he will do a first-order .mil-PF analysis in the Army way. That will allow him to answer these questions. What did he find? What does it mean? What are the limits of his findings? How significant? What are the implications for policymakers? And that's really what the .mil-PF answers. And then what direction is suggested for future research. So if we understand what he's going to do now in paragraphs 3, 4, and 5, he describes his method of analysis in Chapter 3. Chapter 4, he conducts that analysis. Chapter 5, he makes sense of the findings of his analysis. That leads us now back into Chapter 2 to see what kinds of information needs to be provided in Chapter 2 so that the educated reader can evaluate the quality of the argument, examine the sufficiency of the analysis, and then test the conclusions based on context that's provided in Chapter 2. So in Chapter 2, we've got to show us the doctrinal manuals that describe water distribution and how and why we do it. He's got to provide the background documents that go into constituting the case study research for the 3 different case studies. He's got to include material from How the Army Runs manual that will introduce the reader to the suitable, feasible, acceptable model and the .mil-PF analysis model. He's got to include information from FM 3.0, operations, because it's going to describe the Army's future warfighting concept and doctrine for decisive action in combined combined arms maneuver and wide area security, because that's what describes the future requirements and that will allow us to demonstrate that the 3 case studies actually provide coverage of a range of military operations that satisfies those 2 missions. He will need to describe the operational environment, in other words, the future warfare. That can be found in 3.0, and there's some other white papers, but it describes essentially the future requirement that his recommendation in Chapter 5 is going to address. Because there's a high probability that contracting water is going to be a feature of at least one of the solutions, he can take a look at the Gansler Commission or some other source of contracting after-action review to identify the potential but also the limitations of contracting for that set of potential solutions. So by the time he's done, when we've established the importance and the magnitude in Chapter 1 and why this is an important study, Chapter 2 provides all the background material and the context so that we can understand why his method is appropriate to answer the question, how to analyze the quality of his analysis, and then to make judgments about his conclusions and his recommendations. All of those things are what the story that's got to be told now in Chapter 2, so that paper stands on its own and we can evaluate the quality of the paper based on the background material. If he does this, and he will have demonstrated a sufficient coverage of the doctrinal material for us to have confidence that his argument is worthy of examination. So this is a nice little model that helps us unpack what it is that he's got to do, and now I can go through his drafts and final drafts to make sure that there is a connection between everything he says in 3, 4, and 5 has some source material in Chapter 2, and that everything in Chapter 2 is going to be something that he talks about in 3, 4, and 5. If there's something in Chapter 2 that's not covered again in 3, 4, and 5, then it's fluff. We don't need it. But if he says anything that requires a reference or context in 3, 4, and 5, it should find its home back here in Chapter 2. So one of the things that we often find is that Chapter 2 can be the last thing that's written, because you have to double check to make sure there is continuity between those 5 chapters, and Chapter 2 is quite often the last thing that's finalized. So thanks for your attention, and keep studying.